Did you ever get blamed for something you didn't do, just because you were easy to blame?
Mom's voice came through the speaker like she was ordering takeout and not detonating a year of my work. A breezy little sigh, and then the line that made the air in my kitchen feel heavier than concrete. That they had given my money to Emily because she would actually achieve something, and I answered with a steady "thanks for the heads up" that sounded almost polite even to me. While my hand reached for the back of a chair the way you do when the floor tilts and you decide to act like it was part of your choreography all along, because if there is one thing I learned growing up in a house where praise was a coupon that always expired yesterday, it is that staying calm is the only way to make people listen when you start moving the furniture. I let her talk, because she loved to, because explanations made her feel like a reasonable judge instead of the person who had just stolen from her own child, and she did the whole routine about Emily's talent and momentum and how investments are about potential, not fairness, and I told her I understood, the same way you understand that rain is wet and it still ruins the picnic, and in the soft space between her sentences I let myself remember the plain facts in the ugliest light possible. That I had worked every weekend for a year, that I had signed a contract I did not even like because it paid faster, that I had parked the money with them while I wrapped a final client and set up my LLC bank account. Because my parents were supposed to be a safe pocket, not a hole with a smile drawn on top. She said it like it was wisdom, that my sister would take the money and turn it into something, and I asked her, as evenly as I could, whether the something she meant was the second boutique that Emily had floated at Thanksgiving between telling me my sweater looked like a dish rag and showing everyone her vision board in a tone that made the pilgrims feel like they lacked hustle. And Mom laughed that careful laugh that bothered me in high school because it sounded like the first half of a lecture, and she started to list all the family sacrifices that led to this moment, which is a wild way to describe pushing the golden child toward another vanity project with a new neon sign. I said, "Thanks for the heads up" again, and I said it so flat it could have been a cutting board, and she did not hear the click in my voice that means I am done asking for anyone's permission, because for years I learned that approval in our house was a moving target. And today I finally remembered I had my own range, my own arrows, and this was not a parade I needed to stand under anymore. It was a storm I could reroute. She asked why I was so quiet, and I told her I was respecting the decision, because that is what a responsible daughter does, which made her sigh with relief and say she knew I would be mature about this, and I said I was. And while she softened into that little triumph, I opened my laptop and pulled up the folder I keep for emergencies. The one with the boring names that stop people from clicking because nobody wants to read filing receipts or intent to use. And I scrolled to the email chain from early spring when I had sat in a small office next to a potted plant that had given up, filing a simple application with a government website that speaks in forms, an application to claim a name that is not just a name in my family, it is a flag. Emily's chosen boutique brand, the one she had blurted at Thanksgiving like a prophecy, the one I already owned on paper. I did not file it out of spite back then. I filed it the way you lock your front door because sometimes you live near raccoons with keys, and because I had seen the way my parents moved the goalposts any time I got close to putting the ball through. And because protecting my future did not require anyone's blessing, just a signature and a fee and the understanding that being first is not the same as being loud. And now, while Mom went on about family unity, I logged into the account and saw the neat little status that meant the government had said fine, it is yours if you use it, and I had, in a quiet way, with a minimalist landing page, a receipt, and a date stamp. I told Mom I needed to jump onto another call, and she made a point of sounding wounded, like I was abandoning a sick puppy, and I said we would talk later because I wanted to speak like an adult who did not need to justify her breathing. Then I hung up and wrote a short email to a venue manager who had just announced a collaboration pop-up with my sister's brand for early summer, a cheerful message with links that established my ownership and a friendly note that I would hate for them to invest in signage and marketing that could not be used, followed by a similar note to the printer Emily favors, and a takedown request draft for the social handle that uses my registered mark, which is the unglamorous legal version of quietly changing the locks before the thief realizes there was ever a door. I felt the anger settle into something colder and better shaped, like a tool you can actually hold, and I let myself laugh once, not because any of it was funny, but because there is a flavor of relief you only taste when you stop performing at your family's talent show and start producing your own stage. And I typed one more message, this one to my bank, flagging the movement of funds that were mine by agreement, attaching the simple notarized note Mom had signed last fall at the copy shop. When she wanted to be helpful and official, the note that used the word safekeeping in the way people say forever in vows they do not mean, and I hit send with a cleaner heartbeat than I had had all day. When Mom called back a minute later, chirping about how we should schedule a girls' brunch to smooth things over, I answered with a light voice and told her brunch sounded lovely and that I was so glad she had given me a heads up, because it is only fair to give one in return. Then I stared at the timestamp on my email and at the little lock icon on the account that would start a process nobody could unwind with a family meeting, and I said, "You might want to tell Emily to check her inbox." And I let the silence bloom between us like a storm she could hear but not name, because by the time she understood which door I had closed, the latch would already be on the other side. By the time the coffee went cold, I had rehearsed the family script in my head with the same muscle memory you use to tie your shoes, because the pattern did not require imagination, only recall, the way Mom would tilt her head when she called me practical, which in our house translated to pack mule, the way Dad would clear his throat and redirect any praise toward Emily with a statistic about market potential he had skimmed from a magazine at the dentist, and the way my sister could float into a room late, glittering with borrowed confidence, and somehow leave with the one thing I had been methodically building, while I smiled like the dependable stagehand who gets to clap when the star bows. And yet, for once, as I watched the little sent emails line up like dominoes, I felt something old and heavy loosen, because I realized that maturity is often the costume that helps people pull off thefts they prefer to call strategy. When friends in good faith had asked over the years why I kept my money with my parents, I would say that convenience and family were synonyms if you said them softly enough. But the truer answer was that I had been conditioned to move my plans around other people's narratives, to make room at the table for someone who arrived without a dish and left with leftovers. So when I worked those long Saturdays and took that unglamorous contract last fall, I told myself the arrangement was temporary and safe, and I believed it because the lie wore my mother's perfume and the paperwork had her tidy signature next to the word safekeeping. Now, standing in a kitchen that suddenly felt like an office of my own making, I pulled receipts from cloud folders and screenshots from text threads like a magician revealing scarves, not because I feared a fight, but because I had finally decided to win one without raising my voice. I remembered the Christmas when Emily unwrapped a weekend retreat with a branding coach while I got a cookbook titled Quick Meals for Busy Girls, which is perfectly fine and a little funny unless you understand the choreography. And I remembered the graduation where Dad used the applause to tell relatives that my major was nice, but Emily's major was an investment, and I remembered how pity can dress as encouragement when it needs to. That gentle advice to be supportive of the person who is doing something big, and I let the collage of moments harden into focus while I drafted the line of emails that would turn the day's theft into my opening bid, because if the family wanted to make it a market, then fine, I would bring a ledger. The venue manager wrote back first with the careful tone of someone who has been burned by online drama, asking for a phone call and additional documentation and promising that no signage would be ordered until rights were clarified. And the printer followed with a note that sounded apologetic and slightly thrilled, because nothing attracts attention like a trademark dispute with pretty fonts. And while those tabs settled, a separate reply slid into the tray from a payments platform my sister had chosen for her pre-orders, a short message from a trust and safety analyst who wanted to confirm that the merchant had authorization to operate under a name that matched my registration, which is the corporate version of someone knocking politely and then quietly changing the locks on the building before anyone notices the scaffolding. I forwarded that note to myself and then to the attorney friend who had once told me that the calmest letters win the fastest, and I asked her to draft a little bundle that would travel tomorrow morning with the speed of a rumor and the weight of paper. A cease and desist that did not gloat, and a friendly licensing offer that did not beg, because dignity is a better lever than outrage when you intend to move a family that confuses volume with power. She replied almost immediately with one line: that she loved the tone and would send the documents by breakfast, and that I should get some rest, which was kind and hilarious, because rest is for people who are not rearranging the architecture of their childhood before dinner. I clicked into the social handle and filed the claim with screenshots, light on adjectives and heavy on dates, attached the quick invoice from my minimalist landing page, attached the government acceptance letter with the boring seal that I had pretended not to care about when it arrived, and then, because pettiness is tempting, but precision is better, I purchased the .com that Emily had left dangling while she haggled for a cheaper hyphenated version, mapped it to a holding page that said almost nothing and everything at once, and set the email routing so that any curious collaborator landing on her press release would be quietly introduced to me instead, the owner, the mule who learned to carry her own keys. Mom texted in the middle of the admin flurry with a chirpy calendar invite for brunch and a line about wanting to keep the sisterhood strong, which almost made me laugh because the sisterhood in our house had always been a theater with assigned seating. And I typed back a polite acceptance and a time that would keep her busy while the letters went out, then silenced the thread and watched the payment dashboard I had access to through a shared invoice tool flicker from pending to paused while. The analyst flagged Emily's storefront for review, a small status change that looked like nothing and felt like a sunrise, and as the room filled with the pale evening light that sometimes ruins good photos and improves bad plans, the doorbell rang with the impatient rhythm my mother uses when she believes urgency is the same as authority, and I looked at the camera feed where my parents stood on the porch with that bright, brittle smile people wear when they have something to fix and no idea. That? The hinges were already gone. I let them stand on the porch long enough to understand that the doorbell would not bail them out, because urgency had always been their favorite currency, and I was not buying today. And when I finally opened the door, I did it with the measured ease of someone greeting a delivery rather than a crisis, which made Mom's smile strain into that familiar paper crackle shape as she launched the script about misunderstandings and family priorities, and how decisions made in the name of potential should never be confused with theft, while Dad hovered a step behind her, already in referee mode, already preparing the soothing hand gesture that always meant the conversation would end exactly where she wanted it to, and I stepped aside, waved them in, and watched their eyes sweep the kitchen for signs of temper they could weaponize, finding instead a laptop, a neat stack of documents, and a cup with a lipstick ring that I left there on purpose, because props matter when the audience believes they are directing the play. Mom started with a compliment that was not a compliment, that I had always been so good at the logistics and the boring parts, which is why I would understand that their choice to redirect funds was strategic rather than personal. And maybe even something I would have decided on if I could have detached from my feelings, which would have been a decent line in a boardroom if it were not being used to rationalize siphoning the savings of their older daughter to finance the second attempt at a boutique that could not balance its inventory with both hands and a calculator, and I told her that language was useful and that I was grateful for the clarity. Then I turned the laptop so they could see the emails stacked like runway lights and the trust and safety message that said review in a tone that always means halt. And Mom's nostrils flared the way they do when a waiter forgets a side order, and she is deciding whether to punish him or the tip jar. Dad tried the old soft shoe about how families should not bring lawyers into living rooms because it changes the vibe, and I told him the vibe had already changed the day they signed a safekeeping note and then treated it like a napkin drawing. And he cleared his throat and asked for terms like we were talking leases, and I slid forward the single page my attorney friend had drafted in less than an hour because she understood my mother's tempo better than anyone, a lean cease and desist with a gentle licensing option attached, not because I wanted their money, but because offering a path felt like the kind of leverage that makes courts nod. And as Mom skimmed the paragraph, her voice rose into that airy octave she saves for charity galas and moral lectures, insisting that sisters do not sue sisters, and that I was proving why they had invested in the child who leads with vision. A sentence so strange I had to laugh, not loud, just enough to let the air move. She reached for the only lever she had ever trusted, the threat of exile dressed as disappointment, promising that brunches and holidays and any form of soft inclusion would evaporate if I continued to embarrass the family with paperwork. And I thought about the years I had done dishes in her kitchen while Emily rehearsed speeches about scale and branding, and I decided exile was not the punishment she thought it was. I told her that this was not a lawsuit, not yet, just a request to stop using a mark I owned, and that if Emily wanted to operate under that banner, she could license it at a fair rate that would cover my original funds, plus a small monthly fee until she cleared her pre-order backlog. Which is when Mom's face did the quick math and Dad stopped nodding and started blinking in that slow, startled way that happens to men who realize a conversation is actually a contract. The door opened again before anyone could reach for a new bluff, and Emily walked in without knocking because she has never seen a boundary she respected unless there was a velvet rope around it, her phone already filming. Her voice bright with the confidence of someone who believes public shaming is the same as leverage, narrating for an invisible audience that I was sabotaging a female-founded business out of jealousy. And I raised my hand with the calm you save for bees because flailing makes everything worse, and I asked whether she had checked her inbox, and when she said she had not, I told her that her payment portal had paused pre-orders under review, and that any signage order with the new logo would likely bounce once the venue received the packet in the morning. Which is when she lowered the phone a fraction, and the room finally heard itself breathe. She lunged for the only argument that felt hot enough to melt the facts, that the money was hers because Mom had said so and because she would do more with it. And I let her finish the story she liked to call destiny before I reached behind the documents and placed the little Christmas card on the table. The one from last year with the glitter that never washes out. The one where Mom had written a sentimental paragraph about being proud of my grit and then taped in the notarized note that used the exact words safekeeping and return upon request. A card she had made a whole ceremony of when there were witnesses because she loves applause, and I watched the point land without gloating, then added the quiet detail she had not anticipated. That I had already filed a claim with the bank to freeze transfers related to that note until the matter was resolved, which is not revenge as spectacle, it is revenge as gravity, slow and impossible to argue with. In the long coil of silence that followed, Mom shifted from offense to negotiation with the twitch of an eyebrow, offering a family repayment schedule that relied on my patience and her memory, promising that once the pop-up launched she would prioritize making me whole. And I told her she would not need to worry about prioritizing anything because I had already sent the venue a friendly alternative name she could offer Emily for free so that her event would not implode, a name that did not infringe and a lifeline that looked generous in emails. And I watched the second realization click into place, that while the money was paused and the mark was locked, I had still handed them a path that kept their pride intact for cameras and cousins. Which was mercy wrapped around a vice, and as Emily glared and Dad stared at the stove as if it might give him answers, I said we were done for tonight, that they should rest, that tomorrow would be busy, and that if they insisted on using what I owned there would be filings they could not charm their way through, while if they accepted the license for a limited period and the repayment plan drafted by someone who understood calendars better than wishful thinking, we would all get to keep our faces. And when I opened the door to see them out, Emily hissed that I was heartless, and I told her she should hydrate and charge her phone, because morning comes fast when an inbox is full. Morning arrived with the particular brightness that makes everything look like it has edges, and before I had finished the kind of breakfast that barely qualifies as food but counts as resolve, the venue manager called with the careful tone people use when they suspect a harmless brunch has turned into a permit check, explaining that their legal team had reviewed my documents and noticed that the pop-up agreement referenced signage and promotional materials under a brand name now flagged for conflict, which meant their insurance carrier would not cover a thing unless the name changed or a written license dropped into their inbox like a guardian angel with a timestamp. And while he apologized for the inconvenience, I could hear the printer in the background fall quiet, which told me more than his words ever could about where we stood and how quickly the practical world enforces boundaries once the polite world has finished gossiping. Within the hour, a second call landed, this one from the payments platform analyst who had written the understated review note the night before, and he explained in that calmly scripted cadence that despite a merchant's enthusiasm, pre-orders cannot process under a potentially infringing mark without exposing buyers to confusion claims and the platform to risk. So the account would remain paused until evidence of authorization arrived or until a voluntary rebranding request was filed, and he added, almost kindly, that if authorization did not arrive by the end of the business day, the system would initiate a wave of automatic refund notices to customers with a small apology banner about supply chain clarity, which is the sanitized corporate phrase for we do things by the book even when families do not. Mom's text thread, previously an orchestra of punctuation and inspirational quotes, went silent long enough for hope to sound like music, then erupted with a brave little announcement about a minor branding refresh. That would only make the event more exciting, paired with a request for me to be reasonable and to remember that sisters should lift each other, and I typed a reply that would photograph well in court, offering the limited license again at a rate that simply matched the money I had placed in safekeeping plus a manageable monthly fee that would sunset once her backlog cleared, a plan that would put me whole without theatrics and put Emily on stage without minefields. And after I hit send, I forwarded the venue an alternative event name I had already cleaned and searched for conflicts, a serviceable backup that would save their schedule if not their pride. Because sometimes mercy looks like a ladder you hand across the fence while keeping your own yard locked. By lunch, the first supplier folded, a friendly woman who had always liked my holiday cards and who now sent an apologetic email canceling Emily's rush order with a note about wanting to stay neutral in family matters while also staying solvent. And as that domino fell, the influencer who had promised to host a live stream untagged the preview post and slid into my messages with a breezy question about whether the brand transition story could become a joint conversation about responsible business practices for women who build things without parental safety nets, which was both opportunistic and funny and, if I am honest, satisfying in a way that made me want to stand up straighter while also pouring another coffee. The real showdown, as it always is with families that curate their image like a storefront, happened in a room with too many framed photos and a table that had hosted more performative toasts than honest conversations, where Mom had gathered a small audience of aunts and one strategically invited neighbor who volunteers with the Homeowners Association and treats bylaws like bedtime stories. And Mom opened with her usual preamble about misunderstandings and intentions and how I had misinterpreted a temporary shift as betrayal, then tried to pivot to a guilt-laced appeal for unity, but I did not flinch or raise my voice or reach for a memory to prove I had earned fairness. I simply placed 2 envelopes on the table. The first containing the licensing agreement and repayment schedule that would immediately unfreeze the venue, the printer, and the payment portal with 1 signature and 1 same-day wire, and the second containing a notice from the county licensing office confirming that the business certificate under the contested mark belonged to me and that unauthorized public use could trigger a routine visit from a code enforcement officer who is not swayed by family lore or tinted moisturizer. Dad read the first page twice without turning it. Emily stared at the second envelope as if it might sprout legs, and Mom, realizing the room had stopped orbiting her, went for the last lever she trusted, which was to promise that they would replace my funds in a few months and that it would all be easier if I simply withdrew the claims and let the pop-up proceed under the original name because momentum is fragile. And I told her that trust is more fragile than momentum and that the only fragile thing in the room was the idea that I would keep absorbing the cost of their decisions just because we share a last name. Then, because I had learned that consequences must be both visible and boring to be respected, I slid my phone across the table and let them watch me draft the short message to the platform authorizing the release of automatic refunds if a signed license did not arrive by end of day, a message that would start a chain reaction no brunch could reverse and no speech could outrun. The aunt with the softest voice asked if I could wait another day. Emily hissed that I was killing her brand out of spite. Dad tried to soothe the air with a palm that no longer moved anything, and Mom, for once, looked genuinely lost as she asked whether I understood how public this would become if refunds started landing in inboxes with that little banner about clarity, and I said I understood perfectly. That reputations are portfolios and mine had been under their management for too long. And as my finger hovered over the send button, the room held its breath like a choir that forgot the lyrics, while outside a delivery truck downshifted and a wind chime lied about grace. And when Mom finally whispered that she would sign if I removed the marked claim before the live stream, I smiled without warmth and told her that paperwork does not move on wishes and that the platform's timers do not take phone calls. Then I pressed send and watched the screen confirm what I had already decided. In the kitchen yesterday, that some doors, once closed, make a sound that is more liberating than loud, and when Mom reached for my wrist as if she could rewind a clock with her fingers, I pulled gently away and said the quiet sentence that would follow her around the rest of the day like a shadow she could not step out of, that even if she changed her mind, the process had already started and could not be undone. The refund wave moved through the afternoon like a slow storm that did not need thunder to rearrange a coastline, first as a handful of polite emails that customers screenshotted and forwarded to friends with a tone that sounded more curious than angry, then as a visible shift in the pop-ups comment threads where enthusiasm gave way to that subtle social doubt people rarely admit to but always obey, and while the internet did its unglamorous work of adjusting expectations one receipt at a time, I watched the venue's calendar update with a new title placeholder that matched the backup name I had offered, and I listened to the printer confirm that a neutral logo file had been received, which meant the event would happen in a form that did not counterfeit my efforts and did not pretend our family could pass a black light test, and in that quiet steadiness, I realized that vengeance, when it is built with policies instead of punches, feels less like triumph and more like a room that finally locks properly. Emily called twice and texted a paragraph that began with strategy and ended with accusation, insisting that I had ruined a launch whose purpose was to uplift women and to prove that a person with vision can manifest success without gatekeepers, which might have connected if it had not been sent to the person whose money had been rebranded as Momentum and then wired away without consent, and though the pettier part of me wanted to send back a screenshot of the notarized safekeeping note taped inside last year's Christmas card with glitter still glued to the M and Mary, I settled for something cleaner. A brief message that attached the signed license agreement Mom had finally returned with a wire confirmation that cleared my account by late afternoon and a line reminding her that the temporary permission would sunset automatically in a handful of months, at which point she could either buy the mark at a valuation that included the cost of a childhood or continue under the new name that had already printed better on the poster. There are moments in every family saga where you expect a grand finale with violin strings and tears soaked into linen napkins, and there are other moments where the ending sneaks in as a series of administrative closures and forwarding addresses. And ours chose the latter with stubborn insistence, because after the wire settled and the venue reissued its promotion and the platform lifted its paws with language so neutral it could have been carved into courthouse steps, what remained was not a fireworks display of apologies or an embrace on a porch bathed in golden hour light, but a dinner table where my mother set out plates with the tight efficiency of a hostess who refuses to cancel, and where my father poured water as if hydration could lubricate pride, and where Emily arrived 10 minutes late with cheeks too bright and a tone that tried to vault over humiliation into a speech about learning and resilience that would have been moving if it had included the words "I am sorry." I stayed anyway, because walking out would have given them a story about petulance, and walking in kept me aligned with the version of myself I wanted to trust. And I accepted a plate of food I barely tasted while Mom attempted to rebuild a narrative with the tools she understood, which were revised memories and careful omissions, and a refrain about how families must not let business injure blood. And when she finally gathered enough air to suggest that the whole episode had been a misunderstanding that began in kindness and spiraled in the hands of outsiders, I told her that the only outsider in the room had been my own sense of worth, exiled so long it no longer recognized the house, and that bringing lawyers into living rooms is only vulgar when the living room has not been used as a boardroom with softer chairs. There was a clatter of utensils and a silence that felt like a power outage, Then Dad cleared his throat with the gravity of a man approaching a moment he cannot charm away and asked, without theatrics, whether there was any path back to the kind of trust that allows people to hold funds for each other without contracts, and I admitted that I did not know. That trust was less a path and more a language, and that mine had grown halting with disuse. And while I said it, I understood what I had been avoiding all day, that getting my money back and securing my work had been only the practical half of the equation, because the part that sits beneath the ledger and under the mark registration and inside the polite emails was a quieter balance sheet, the kind that measures whether you will ever hand someone your keys again and sleep soundly. After dinner, I walked with Mom to the door, and she lingered with a smile that looked like it had been ironed onto her face, telling me that she had always believed in my discipline and that if I had only communicated sooner, we could have prevented the unpleasantness. And I said that discipline is what you develop when belief is rationed, that sooner would have changed none of the instincts that led her to treat my labor like a revolving fund for my sister's resume, and that unpleasantness is not a storm that arrives uninvited. It is a crop you seed every time you confuse generosity with access and family with entitlement, and as the words hung there like a portrait that refuses to level, she reached for my hand with a softness that nearly undid me and asked if I could at least agree that none of this should be public, because reputations stick, and I told her reputations stick precisely because they tell the truth that room tone cannot drown. On the drive home, I thought about the license clock that had started ticking with her signature, about the fee that would deposit each month like a reminder, and about the sunset date when the mark would either return to my sole use or be purchased in a transaction that left no room for sentiment. And it occurred to me that all of this might read to strangers as ruthless when it was, in fact, a kind of careful love directed at the only person I can control, a promise that the next time someone calls casually to reroute my life, they will find fewer buttons to press and more doors that do not open from the outside. Yet, even as I felt steadier than I had in years, a sliver of doubt slid in with the night air through the cracked window. Because power does not erase history and justice does not always taste clean, and when my phone buzzed with a final message from Emily that contained no apology and no accusation, only a short request to meet next week to discuss the future of the name, I stared at it longer than I meant to and wondered whether the truth I had protected would free me or circle back in a form I could not predict, and because I have finally learned to let a question live without strangling it for comfort, I did not answer immediately. I drove in the direction of a small rented office where my own sign waits patiently for a wall, and I let the evening hold its breath around a possibility I will not label too quickly, knowing that some victories pull you forward and some simply stop you from walking backward, and that either way, once certain processes begin, even love cannot undo them.